Vietnam's development achievements are absolutely remarkable.
Vietnam's economy jumped by 8% this year.
Vietnam is nothing short of an economic revolution. In the 1980s, Vietnam was one of Asia's most underperforming economies. And then, in the span of a few decades, Vietnam's economy grew exponentially. In 2022, the country's growth rate was 8.02%, outpacing Asian giants like India and China. As it stands today, Vietnam's GDP per capita has grown tenfold since the 1980s to a whopping figure of $4,316 in 2023. And for this emerging Asian tiger, this is just the beginning. So how does a war-stricken economy become one of the fastest-growing industrial zones in the world? Before we jump into this story of economic resilience and survival, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more. Let's get started. The Doi Mai effect. The World Economic Forum defines Vietnam as the land of boundless energy. One walk in its capital city, Hanoi, would show you that it's a world of its own. From its bustling street markets to sophisticated corporate headquarters, the country shows you the new age of a fast-track economy that has become the benchmark of modernization and growth. But the Vietnam we know today wasn't the Vietnam 4 decades ago. When the 2 decades-long war ended in Vietnam, the country was in shambles. As one of the poorest countries in the world, its GDP per capita was stuck between $200 and $300 in the mid-1980s. Almost all 5-year plans had failed miserably. In 1986, something magical happened. The government introduced a New Age or the Doi Mai reforms that were aimed to steer Vietnam into becoming the socialist market-oriented economy it is today. At its very core, the Communist Party of Vietnam removed many self-imposed barriers to self-growth. This is to say that the country was essentially trying to find growth and progress in models used by the Soviet Union and other Eastern European states. And we don't have to tell you how their economic policies turned out to be a major flop in the long run. If anything, the fall of the Soviet Union would show you that. Vietnam had learned an early lesson though. It got rid of major chunks of state-controlled enterprise, invested in building a private industrial sector, liberalized the private markets, and hoped for a major boost in FDIs. Under Doi Mai, Vietnam also gave more liberties to the farm owners and kickstarted its regime to recognize land and property rights. These reforms proved to be highly successful. From a country suffering through acute food shortages, Vietnam began to export its rice to diverse markets. In 1989, 2 very monumental things happened for the country. First, its military withdrew forces from Cambodia to begin a new age of peace in the country, and second, that year, Vietnam exported 1.4 million tons of rice. Believe it or not, in the years to come, it will be Vietnam's booming food market that will keep the world from starving in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. The period following the Doi Mai reforms brought a 6.5% economic growth, a figure that was unprecedented for a developing economy. Vietnam's row with China. Alongside the reforms at home, Vietnam became a hotspot for gathering FDIs. In its 35 years of unprecedented growth, the country has converted $450 billion in foreign direct investment into major gross domestic product and other lucrative businesses. Vietnam was indeed able to harness human capital into one of its biggest selling points. Big names like Samsung and LG decided to set up their shops in the country for that very reason. However, in Vietnam's roaring success as an FDI, and a manufacturing powerhouse in Southeast Asia, there's an unlikely ally too. Of course, we're talking about China, whose geopolitical fluctuations and instability made Vietnam the knight in shining armor. Major corporations, particularly the American and European businesses, can't exactly call China market-friendly like it used to be in the 1990s. Not to mention, over the years, the major escalation in the US-China economic war has put the 2 superpowers at odds against each other. These escalations in geopolitical tensions have an uncertain military tangent too, and corporations can't afford to get tangled up in another Cold War-type situation. So where do they go? Which economy gives them a stable and cheap supply of labor, as well as protective measures like unsuspecting governments? They go to Vietnam, of course. There's a reason why the country has one of the fastest-growing digital economies in the world. A joint report by Alphabet, Temasek Holding, and Bain & Company revealed that the country's digital economy would amount to $45 billion by 2025. This robust growth in the digital economy is opening new fronts in Vietnam where businesses constantly look for accessible e-commerce options. When Vietnam joined the ASEAN bloc, it was opening up itself to a new flush of business that desperately needed an alternative manufacturing hub to China. The paralyzing impact of the global pandemic on China just shows the world that investing in Vietnam was a reasonable and sound idea. Today, other than hosting old businesses like LG, Payoneer, Lego, Samsung, Nike, Intel, and Apple, Vietnam is pushing for new business from Meta, Netflix, and Boeing. What this means is that the Asian tiger is looking forward to a stable stream of FDIs that remains crucial for its resilient GDP growth. Vietnam's commitment to producing a skilled workforce and bridging gender and socio-economic inequalities has also been pretty remarkable. The World Economic Forum notes that Vietnam has done substantially well in making sure its development is inclusive and sustainable. These are the values that Western institutions like the IMF and the World Bank value. And even if corporations are just concerned about finding a reliable supply chain in Vietnam, they are more likely to invest in the country if they find a skillful and inclusive labor force. Vietnam's post-COVID recovery. Plus, robust statistics speak of Vietnam's success too. Its literacy rate is more than 95%, and the employment rate is almost 72% in 2023. These figures also show us that Vietnam's economic recovery from the global pandemic was relatively higher than China's. For a country that relies heavily on manufactured goods, shutting its border during the pandemic was almost lethal. Yet, the country's policymakers were successful in curbing the spread of COVID quite effectively. The limited economic fallout in the country meant that it became a corporation's major hotspot to keep its business running, while China and Taiwan were still learning the ropes of institutionalizing healthcare policies. Just Apple alone relocated 11 of their biggest manufacturing plants in the country, leaving behind China and Taiwan. When economists talk about a multipolar economic order in Asia, Vietnam is set to lead the continent by example. Its model economy recovery from the pandemic while attracting major FDIs is a revolution within itself, something that China couldn't even dream of replicating. In 2022 alone, Vietnam added new projects worth $9.9 billion USD, while the total export and import turnover rates grew by 5.7%. For the Asian tiger, the progress just didn't stop there. It also began to lay plans for rapid expansion of its major electrical vehicle developer, VinFast, in the US and Asia. Now, this expansion plan just doesn't exist in isolation. Just like the US, Vietnam also has plans for mining lithium to sustain its local EV brand and open up its market for fully furnished lithium-ion batteries. While these plans are not churning up billions for Vietnam right now, the country hasn't ever said never say never. But of course, Vietnam's trajectory to remain a stable economy isn't hassle-free. Even today, Vietnam is grappling with major problems like an authoritative government that infringes on civil liberties like privacy and cybersecurity. When it comes to upholding major human rights in the country, the government falls short. But that's only one side of the story. Vietnam's over-reliance on foreign direct investment and major exports also puts the country in a vulnerable spot. If the Asian tiger wants to keep roaring, it will have to keep attracting FDIs. And more, it will have to continue to sell the furnished goods to the world. Enjoyed this video? Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. See you next time!